Today we are at the University of Minnesota Law Library, actually sitting in a room dedicated to Vance Opperman, who was the former president of the West Publishing Company and known to many of us in our profession. We're talking to the director here at the Law Library, Joan Howland, who is technically the Roger F. Noreen Professor of Law and the Law School's Associate Dean for Information and Technology. Joan joined the faculty at the University of Minnesota in 1992 as a tenured professor of law, but was named the Noreen Professor in 1996. Joan, let's talk a little bit about yourself when you were young and today, your life generally.
Well, I was born in Northern California, in a town called Eureka, and we moved to Palo Alto, California when I was 4, and I spent most of my childhood in the Bay Area. I am definitely a child of the baby boom era. I was born at a time when I think many parents felt that with education and hard work, any child could achieve anything, and they certainly instilled those values and gave me the support I needed when it was time for me to move on in my life. I also had the opportunity to go to the University of California at a time of the golden era of the UC system, and I was privileged enough to have an excellent education at the University of California at Davis, which I think has been the foundation of everything I have accomplished in my life.
Well, it's an interesting place. I visited the University of Davis a few weeks ago. Talked to our colleague Mort Schwartz,
Yes,
who is the
yes.
retired director there. And, we did an interview for this project. Mort has an interesting little dog named Tony, and the dog wanted to be part of the action, so he'd been given a bone, which he would normally take off to chew on elsewhere. Well, he stayed. And so we have in the background on that particular tape this noise, and Mort and I finally just introduced old Tony and what was going on.
Well, if I'd known that, I would have brought my pets along.
Well, you never know.
You never
a
know.
few props.
You never know.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your education. You've mentioned that you went to the university.
Yes, I went to the University of California at Davis, and in fact, when I was there, I'm not sure if Mort was the director or not. I don't know, but they just opened the law school, and I had a job filing loose leaf in the law library, but little did I know I would ever become a law librarian. When I graduated, I went to the University of Texas to get a master's degree in history. At that time, it still does, the University of Texas has one of the finest programs in the history of the West in the country, and American West, and that was what I was interested in. During my time in getting my master's, I found what I really enjoyed was the research aspect of it, and so I began to take some classes in the library school at the University of Texas, and one of my advisors in the history department was a lawyer. And he suggested one day that I walk across campus and talk to someone named Roy Mirsky about going into law librarianship. And so I just wandered across campus one day, and I spoke to Mr. Mirsky, and it was just it was almost an informational interview. But during the course of the conversation, it came up that that my parents still lived in Palo Alto, and shortly thereafter, he called me and told me that he had arranged for me to have an interview at the Stanford Law Library. Now, I knew nothing about law. I really had only taken a few classes in library science, but I had finished my master's degree, and so I thought, well, that's an option. I mean, it wasn't an option, it was an interview maybe, but I was thinking about going home anyway, so I flew back to Palo Alto, and I interviewed at the Stanford Law Library, but this was, all they had open was a clerical position, and so I interviewed, and one of the things I remember most about that interview, which I've always tried to remember in my life, is that I was, 22 years old, and this was a relatively low in the hierarchy clerical position. But everyone I spoke to asked me, "Can I call you Joan, or would you prefer Miss Howland?" And I just remembered how professional that struck me. But to make a long story short, I was hired as kind of a serials person. But Mr. Jacobstein was in Europe at the time, and so I started my job, and it was kind of in the back room, and it wasn't until I'd been there about 5 months that he walked by one day and said, "Who exactly are you?" And so that was my beginning in law
That's
libraries.
right. Mike Jacobstein didn't hire you in the normal sense.
Then-
His friend over in Texas
did.
sort of did.
When he had completely forgotten that this had ever happened. And I think this shows a certain kind of personality that I think sometimes we see with young people today, is that, you know, I got the job there in August, and I kind of had been thinking about law librarianship, or librarianship, I wasn't sure. But, you know, by January I was enrolled at San Jose State, which was close by, and I could commute after school and that sort of thing. But I didn't let that time languish at all. You just kind of jump in, you don't listen. And I was very, very fortunate when they were moving into the new building 2 years later at Stanford. They realized they were going to need another reference librarian. Now, I still knew very little about the law, but Mr. Jacobstein called me in his office one day, and he said, "Well, you know, we've decided when you get your library degree that we'll turn you into a reference librarian." And this, of course, was another era. There was no posting for this job.
Life was very
they were
different.
easy in those days. And so I started on the reference desk there in 1975, I guess, in the fall. And I wasn't even through library school yet. And it was a wonderful opportunity, though. And it's one of those things I've never looked back. It was just great.
Well, you've had a variety of positions in our profession. You were at Harvard at one point, right out of final school.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about perhaps that
Yeah.
position and the others you've had over the
Yeah.
years, and perhaps some of what you've been able to accomplish in them?
Well, I think if I could just go back a step, you
Oh,
know,
please
what
do.
happened at Stanford was that, once again, I knew nothing about law librarianship and about the law, and I was fortunate enough to work with a woman named Adriana Dawn, who then eventually went to UCLA, and she really taught me what common law was, what civil law was, and it was like what you should do. She let me make some mistakes, but she really helped me, and she was a wonderful mentor, along with Mr. Jacobstein and Rosalie Long, who was the deputy director there. And they were all just wonderful people to work with, and they really encouraged me to go to law school. So I had so Santa Clara has a part-time program, and so they were able to encourage me to go there at night. But during that time, you know, I was kind of given increasing responsibility, and one of the real benefits of it is that I also had the opportunity to work with Iris Wildman, who she was one of those rare librarians, and I say rare in a very positive way, who had both a background in technical services and public services, and she really taught me how to understand how important understanding how things are cataloged and classified made to the research process. And but I was very comfortable at Stanford, and it was a great job. And but when I was last semester in law school, Mr. Jacobstein would, you know, he said, "Don't take this personally, but here's a job, you know, here's a job you might be interested in." And that he was the kind of mentor who was, you know, really wanted his people to move on. And this is something I try to remember too, is that when I did apply for the job at Harvard, Mr. Jacobstein called me into his office, and he said, "Joan, these are the kind of questions they're going to ask you." And you know, you kind of think you know what they're going to ask you, but he said, "You know, they're going to ask you about collection development at Stanford. Well, you know, this is our policy. This is the kind of policy they might have." You know, and he just kind of walked me through the whole interview. So when I interviewed there, I was incredibly well prepared. And in fact, a side story on this, I was so well prepared because the night before, Virginia Wise, who was the associate librarian for public services that I was going to be replacing, she was moving to BU to be the director, she had kind of figured out they were going to take me to one of two restaurants. And so we went to what she thought was going to be the restaurant, and we figured out what I could order without spilling it on myself. And so I had this rehearsal dinner, and then the next day when they did take me out to dinner, luckily they did take me to this restaurant, and I didn't know if I could eat scallops without spilling on myself, and so that was a very positive experience. But so I was fortunate enough to then move on to the Harvard Law Library as their associate librarian for public services, which was a big job. You know, to go from, you know, a smaller shop, an excellent shop, but a smaller shop at Stanford, to all of a sudden being supervising over 40 people, and but it was a wonderful experience to work with Terry Martin. And
Terry was there.
yeah,
Yes.
and Terry I think, as everyone who knows him would say, is that he has one of the most creative, inquisitive minds. And this was in 1983, and he was really moving forward with technology, but also in the ways that he could look 20 years out. He wasn't sure what was going to happen in 20 years out, but he really taught me, not to hold back either yourself or your library, but to just continually move. And then, so he was great. And what was wonderful about that job, it was balanced by Sandy Coleman, who was the deputy director there, who had an MBA. And she really taught me about the business of running a library. It's kind of one of those things, you're a librarian in your heart, but you should be a business person in your head. And so that was an exciting time to be at Harvard, because they were still in an older facility, in a facility that hadn't been renovated, and they were having to push forward with technology. So it was a great time to be there.
I remember the Langdell building.
Yes.
Library. It was a beautiful place, but it was old. And,
well, I always think, it's changed now and it's wonderful, but I still think that going into that library, like, at 6:30 in the morning or on a Saturday morning before it opened, it was almost a spiritual experience, because it was such a beautiful room.
Were the Moody sisters?
No, the Moody sisters had left.
Had left.
Those, as people know, were two sisters who had worked there for many, many years in, I guess, cataloging and acquisitions. Myrtle and Margaret Moody, yes. Yeah. But people talked about them all the time, even when I was there.
I imagine they were really had been there a long time.
Yeah.
An awful lot.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So then you were at Harvard for a while.
Yes, and then I had the opportunity, Bob Beering called me, and he had a position for a deputy position, which was going to be a new position at Berkeley. He was the director of UC Berkeley. And I wasn't really thinking about moving. I thought I'd probably stay I'd been at Harvard for about almost 2 years, and I did, but the opportunity to work with Bob was attractive, but I was still very attractive. But my father became ill, and he lived in Palo Alto with my mother, and so I decided, well, maybe that's a sign that I should do it. So I was fortunate enough to get an interview with Bob and to be offered the position. Of course, shortly after I was offered the position, my father miraculously recovered. It was not, it was a misdiagnosis, but that was great, because I could move back to California, and and that was a really interesting job, because they'd never had a deputy director. So Bob and I had to kind of figure out what that position would be. But and I tell people all this all the time. I've had many wonderful jobs, and they're all wonderful, but at that point, I think that my office was, I had Bob Beering on one side of me, and I had Tom Reynolds on the other.
Oh,
I mean,
yes.
If you can't learn in that environment, it was just a wonderful experience, and they both taught me a lot. Bob was the kind of person who, would let you push your envelope, and occasionally I would make mistakes and things, and he was very helpful in helping me work through those mistakes. But he was, just a wonderful mentor in the sense of, how to be a good administrator, calm, be very, very rational, never make a decision based on emotions, and just a lot of common sense, And Tom, I think, was just such an intellectual, and so just had such a vast array of knowledge that it was just an amazing time to be there.
Well, before Bob came as director, Tom, in effect, was the real director under the predecessor. And I remember talking with him a while back. He was explaining that one of the concerns that everybody had when Bob was coming as director, would Tom feel comfortable relinquishing that? Well, he was delighted to relinquish it. He had his own things he was trying to do.
Exactly. I mean, I wasn't there, but I assumed that it gave Tom the opportunity more time to work on his true intellectual interests.
Which he were considerable. And
But he still, because he knew everything in the library, I think that Bob utilized, and I did too, to kind of and Tom gave me great guidance all the time, but as a sounding board, he was great. He was very much.
Well, they're both very special people.
They're incredibly special people, and it's really a privilege to work with them.
So you were there, and I know one of the little projects we both got involved in over the years, right as you were getting ready to leave to come here, was the ALL annual meeting was in San Francisco.
Well, one of the highlights of my life was being able to work with you when you were president of ALL, and Virginia Kelch and I were in charge of local arrangements for San Francisco. And of course, San Francisco is a city we all love very much, but Virginia loved it and I loved it, and so our whole emphasis was really showing off San Francisco, as well as this was a time when there weren't so many budgetary constraints.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you were wonderful about just kind of letting us take their lead.
Yeah, my role as president came a couple of years later.
Yeah, because you were program chair.
I was now program
chair. Oh, but well, I remember that you were just so. Oh, Carolina Hearn was president.
Yeah,
yes,
she was
the that's right.
That's
but,
right.
But we all worked together as a great team, and I just remember that it was. I think Virginia and I worked very well together, and
we did have a good team. It was interesting. I thought that the organization would be a little more fixed, but there was an awful lot of flying by the seat of our pants, so to speak, in some of the early parts of that, getting that meeting underway.
Well, and I think especially as we did it was kind of, it was like, better to ask for forgiveness later than permission right now.
We all operated that way and still do. I'll bet.
But you know, it was, and I still remembered, I loved our closing reception, which was the closing banquet, because they had everybody went to in those days, and we did, it was black and white ball theme, so kind of understated elegance, and we just had a great time.
I remember we had to close the exhibit hall Tuesday. The meetings in those days went through Wednesday, and the banquet was Wednesday evening. And at the end, the exhibit hall used to close about noon on that day. But in order to turn the room, because there was only one room large enough to hold the exhibit hall and also the banquet, it was the same room.
Yeah.
They had to get rid of one of them as an occupant in order to put the other one in. That was the last year, I think, that ALL held a meeting inside a single hotel.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I think it was the next year we started to move into convention centers, which of course changed the dynamics, as you well know, and in good ways and not so good.
The other thing about that meeting was the West Party on Monday night was held at the Marriott, if you remember.
Yes.
And that was a couple blocks away. Yeah. But many people weren't familiar with San Francisco, and so Bill Lindbergh, who was organizing the events at this point, he hired a theatrical troupe that did like the parades for Chinese New Year's. Mm-hmm. So remember, we had a big dragon going down the street and the drums, and it was so much fun. And that really, I mean, the Chinese community is so much part of San Francisco that it was wonderful that could be incorporated into the
we also held the opening reception at the Marriott.
Yeah, that's right.
Again, because in the Hilton, where the main convention was, we didn't have the space.
Yes.
Now, we'd had a lot of smaller rooms, and that allowed me to put on more programs than had been the norm in the past, and that was nice. I thought that was wonderful for me. I could say yes to more of the proposals that were made for programs. Mm-hmm. Well, you were at the University of California at Berkeley.
Yeah.
And then that same summer you were attracted to come back here to the University of Minnesota.
Well, you know, it's one of those sort of things. I think my career path was a little different than some people in that I really had been I got my library degree in 1975, and I didn't really become a director until 1992, and that was a slower path than other people took. But it was always important for me that I always wanted to work in big research libraries, and I felt that slow and steady, sets the pace.
Well, you certainly were in 3 tremendously big research libraries over the career, including this one here at the University of Minnesota.
Well, and when I got asked to interview at Minnesota, I couldn't believe that they were even calling me, really, but it was because it's such a. I mean, Kathy Price had been the director, George Grossman had been the director. I mean, it was legendary, and it was a wonderful. It still is a fantastic library, And once again, this was an opportunity that I think you probably see a theme in my remarks, is
Mhm.
that when it was so nice that Bob kind of sat down before I interviewed and kind of went through all sorts of things with me, and they'd sent me all the budget figures, and I kind of understood them, but we kind of walked through them together. And then Mr. Jacobstein was great, because
Mhm.
he really talked to me about the history of Minnesota, and I think what kind of he kept selling me on it, he goes, if you walk through the stacks in Minnesota, you see that they've never really had a serious decline in the budget. Like if you go through some stacks, you'll see,
Eras that are
eras
sort
that
of life
aren't
on
reached.
things, yes.
And he said it's one of the great law libraries. And
Mhm.
once again, I was very fortunate that Bob Stein, who was the dean then and is now on our faculty here at Minnesota, really he gave me a shot, because I was a deputy director. I think everybody else who was interviewing was a director, but he gave me a shot, and it's been a wonderful experience to be here. I think, and of course, I called Kathy. We're good friends. She was at the Library of Congress then, and I said, well, I've been offered this job at Minnesota, and she kind of went through all the real positives of it, and then she said, but of course, Joan, the real positive is the staff here at Minnesota, and she's just absolutely right. I mean, you've already spoken to Suzanne Thorpe, who works here,
Yes.
and who is fantastic. But it's an incredible staff, and they I cannot believe how blessed I am to work with them. And just this week, we had a retirement event for someone who's been here 44 years, and someone else who's been here, I think, over 30 years. But long-term staff who are still dedicated, still energized, who just do whatever needs to be done to make it a great library. And I think probably working for Kathy inspired them, and working for George inspired them. But it's a great library, great staff, and very well respected by the faculty, which I think makes a big
The
difference.
staff can make or break the
Yes.
director. I mean, you can be every bit a good director, or actually you can probably be a pretty mediocre one. If
Yeah.
you have the right staff, they can carry it.
Well, and I think once you have good staff in place, then you can attract good staff.
Yes.
And I think that that's really important. And I think, I mean, you really, and I think something I've learned in my career is that, you really have to look at people and say, are they a fit for this staff?
Mhm.
Not are they so much are they fit for the job, fit for the institution, fit as a relationship with the director, but do they fit with the staff?
Yeah.
And I think that's really an important thing to think about, and I think it's a lesson I've learned.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the director's role, be whatever title is used today, associate dean, to empower
Yes.
those that work there to do their best.
Yes.
And meet the needs of the institution in a much more effective way
Yeah.
than might otherwise be the case.
I agree with you 100%. And I think that that's one of the challenges for directors today, and maybe it's always been, is to try to share as much as possible about what's going on in the institution. I think sometimes someone who's a director knows a lot more about what's going on with the curriculum, or what's going on with the large budget of the law school or the university, what sort of people are new hires are, what their interests might be,
Certainly.
how the learning preferences for your students change, and sometimes it's important just to share that information. And sometimes they know it, but to just kind of share it. I think, especially 2013, legal education is changing dramatically,
Yes.
and I think it's important to share that with everyone too. So it's, but that's part of the job.
Well, you wear several hats here at the law school in a sense.
Yes.
You're also a teacher.
Yes.
And I've noticed in looking at background information to prepare for today that you have a subject interest in Native American law and culture. Could you talk a little bit about perhaps how you developed that and a little bit about it?
Yes, I'll be happy to. And I guess, I might start by saying that one of the words of advice that Kathy Price gave me as I came here, she had taught evidence here. And she said, Joan, you're a member of the faculty. You're tenured, you're going to be, they were kind enough to bring me in with tenure, is that be a true member of the faculty, teach a substantive
Be
law course.
perceived as a true member of the faculty
faculty.
by the faculty.
And you know, and it's interesting here is that's the tradition here. And George Grossman's taught us
Mhm.
substantive law, but I have an office in the library, and I
Mhm.
also have an office on the faculty floor. And that was a tradition. Kathy
Mhm.
had one, and that has made all the difference too. You know, because it part of it is I see my colleagues walking down the hall and seeing them, and
You walk to get a cup of
of
coffee or
and
something,
yeah.
and there you are
You
chatting
get
in the
with it.
hall.
And so that
Yeah.
makes, and I think also, as a faculty member who teaches a substantive law class, I'm using the services of the library, the
Mhm.
way the faculty are using it. And it's very rewarding for me because I see what a great staff we have and what wonderful services they are, but it's also a good position to be in. As far as teaching American Indian law, you know, as I mentioned, I got my master's in history of the West at the University of Texas,
Mhm.
and of course, a lot of the focus of that sort of study was the westward migration, and of course, you can't talk about that without focusing on the American Indian experience. And then, though, I've always been interested in American Indian culture, American Indian law. My father came from an American Indian background,
Mhm.
and so it's something that always interested me. And then when I kind of had thought about what would I want to teach, I knew the history part of that, and then constitutional law has been something I have always been
Mhm.
gravitated towards,
Yeah.
and certainly that affects American Indian law. But it just seemed like a good class that would also complement some other courses in the law school, which would give me another opportunity to collaborate with other faculty.
Mhm.
And that still goes on. You know, the class I teach every year, I compare my syllabus and have a meeting with the other person on the faculty, Professor John Burroughs, who teaches the Federal American Indian Law class, which is more, it's more kind of, if a student were going to take one class, that's what they would probably take, but we kind of look at their syllabus, we look at our syllabuses, and so that my class, which really has more of a historical perspective on it, complements that class very well. But it's the other thing that's nice about teaching in that way is it gives me something to do research on and to write on, but also, you know, every semester I have a core group of students who can help me find out what's really going on in the law school, in the sense, not in the good stuff in the bad, but you know, if something in the library isn't running smoothly.
They get to know you,
yeah.
and you get to know them. That's one of the
yeah.
disadvantages I found as a director often was that my role was somewhat isolated from the front line of the library, but I also taught substantive courses, and I did get to know students in that role.
For many years, I also taught kind of a law and cyberspace course, and that was really very, very exciting. It was a wonderful time to be doing it, but then that's the kind of course where you really have to be, you know, every week it's changing so dramatically, and I was getting involved, well, in fact, I was getting involved in some other things, and I was asked to teach in the business school in their executive MBA program to teach business law, and it seemed to me that probably I wasn't going to be able to balance American Indian law, the business law course, and stay on top of the cyber law stuff to the point where I could really teach it. So that was a great thing to do, though, and that's, you know, I think if you have an intellectual interest and you can turn it into a course that really makes a difference. But I'm, as you know, I mean, you taught, but you know, I know that Steve Barkin at Wisconsin teaches torts. I mean, many of our colleagues teach, and I think it makes a big difference.
I think it makes, as you say, the faculty, the teaching faculty perceive you as much more of a colleague if you do the same sorts of things. I heard time and again that basically when I was, because I taught the entire time I was at American U. It was expected. I was a member of the faculty, and everybody teaches. Now, I didn't teach a full load like everybody else, because I had my day job running the library.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what it is. It's something that's going to take up your weekends and your nights, but it really, it pays off.
Yeah. Well, I taught one course each semester, and I taught courses that didn't change too dramatically. One of them was Admiralty, it goes back thousands of years and hasn't changed that greatly, and yet it was basically, it did tie me up for a good solid day, just getting that class ready.
Even if you taught it before, you just, you know. But I think the other thing about teaching a substantive law class, it also gives you another scholarly interest.
It does.
And I think especially if you are a tenured faculty member and want to be respected, be considered a colleague, fully a colleague, it's important to do research beyond just law librarianship. And I think whatever you do is going to help you be a stronger librarian. Well, you can incorporate that. But I think it gives you that other edge to do it, because that was something Mr. Jacobstein also taught me, is that you got to write. You have to
very
write.
accomplished writer, and maybe we could focus on some of the things you've written over the years.
Well, I think it changes as you kind of
Yeah.
go through. I think that like when I first came here, I was working a lot on management issues and a lot of focus on diversity issues.
Mhm.
And I think most of that was written, a lot of it was written from the library perspective and that sort of situation. And then when I got my MBA, I started doing more of kind of the business approach to things. Some of my writing with American Indian law has nothing to do with librarianship or diversity, really. It's, everything with American Indian law should reflect on diversity, but it's on something like gaming or something like that. And right now, I think as I get more senior and have a little more flexibility, what I'm working on is something to have to do with Samuel Johnson and his dictionary.
Oh.
And of course, this kind of takes
Really
you back to being
sort
a
of
librarian.
moving,
Yeah, and that's really
wide,
interesting.
a wide field.
Yeah. But I also I've been here probably 10 years, maybe not that long, maybe 8 years, but I was feeling pretty comfortable in my job. I felt that I had a good relationship with the dean, and it was after I was fortunate enough to be granted the Noreen chair, and I had my annual review with the dean, Tom Sullivan, who became our provost, and he was the dean at that time, the provost, and now he's the president of the University of Vermont. But we had my annual review with him, and it was just more of a conversation. But he was looking at my publications that year, and he kind of looked at my resume, and he looked up and he said, "Oh, a book on the law of thoroughbred racing, horse racing. It must be nice to have tenure in a chair." Because that really wasn't what most people would be writing on. But I have a passion for horse racing, and my colleague Mike Hannon and I co-authored it. But it was, I think you should, at a certain point, you just start doing scholarship on things that are fun.
Yeah. Well, I think that sounds like a wonderful. So many people say that the jobs become boring after a while. This must keep it just fresh.
Well, yeah, I think everybody's job is fresh. And especially when you work with great staff. So you walk in the morning and you say, "Oh no, what's going to happen today?" But when you have people that you know,
spend your entire day micromanaging and doing all that sort of thing, or you won't have a great staff for long.
And I think, and I'm really not idly complimenting the people at the University of Minnesota Law Library, my colleagues on the library staff, is that, that the type of staff that, you give them a project or you give them an assignment, and it's 20 times better than you ever could have conceived that you could have done it yourself. They take a project and they just run with it. So it makes my life very happy.
You have, in addition to all the work here, previous positions, and all the writing and teaching and all of that, we've already mentioned the fact that you were part of the management of a local annual meeting some years ago. But you've done a lot of other things in the profession, sort of service to the profession type thing. Could we talk a little bit about some of those? Well,
I've been active in the American Association of Law Libraries, and I was education chair for with Dick Danner, who's right here in Minneapolis, but he was president, and that's always been incredibly rewarding. I would say in the last almost 15 years, though, I've probably been more involved in the American Bar Association and the American Association of Law Schools. I think when I started here, shortly after I became a director, I was invited to be on-site evaluation teams for the American Bar Association for the 7-year sabbatical visits to various law schools. And from that, I was very fortunate, and I know that Dan Freeling facilitated this because I followed him on this, or at least recommended me, and I will always be grateful to him for that, is I had the opportunity to serve on the American Bar Association Accreditation Committee, which is the committee that really is integral to the process of the sabbatical visits, reaccreditations of the law school. And that was a wonderful experience because you really, I think, begin to fully understand how a whole law school works, not just the library. But when you see these reports, and you see it much more than just being on a visit, but you see all the different issues that affect a law school and how different law schools are dealing with them, you also see the full range of types of law schools and the different ways that law schools are prioritizing, what they're emphasizing, what different experiences students can have at different law schools. And I say that in the positive, but, you know, in the sense of what there's a law school for everyone. And I think I was also very fortunate, after being on the accreditation committee, to be appointed to the council, which oversees the committees of the section of legal education admission to the bar, which includes the accreditation committee. And I think that that has probably been one of the best experiences of my life, because you're really dealing with the issues that are facing legal education in this country. And I think especially now, 2013, with all the financial constraints and problems that are going on in this country. I think we're coming out of it, but, you know, still things are different. How the job market is completely changing for law schools, how the practice of law is completely changing, how law schools are changing, is that legal education has to be responsive to all of these. And so it's a very exciting time to be in it. And, you know, it takes a lot of my time, and I always have to reflect back, how does this affect my job as being director of the law library? And I think I can come up on the upside that it's very worthwhile, because the most important thing I think I've learned from that is, from working on the accreditation committee and on council, is I've learned to think like a dean. Because I look at the issues they're dealing with. I work on the council with not only federal judges and practitioners, but some really sharp deans. And I think it's taught me, as I do my work in the library, is everything you have to step back and look at it from the perspective of the dean.
Yes.
Now, that doesn't mean that you have to make the same decision your dean would make necessarily,
I mean,
but you have to be
basically the one hired to promote the library in the right sense.
And and so it really helps me if I have to discuss an issue with the dean, whether it be financial or personnel or something like that. I can always kind of think about it from the dean's perspective and think about it from the library perspective, and that kind of helps me frame my comments to the dean and my statements. And also, I think in some ways it's helped me that, sometimes I think, oh God, it'd be great if the library could do this. But it really makes me say, well, if you kind of look at all the priorities of the dean, it helps me say, the library really should do this because it's going to help the law school here, and here. And, and it's been a great experience, and I think it's really made me a better law librarian.
It ought to make you a better law librarian, because the dean then can respect you because you respect the dean, and realize that the dean has to look at it from a different perspective, a more sort of higher level look down.
Well, you talk the dean's language.
That's right.
And also it's one of those sort of things that I in my job now I focus a lot on, or I get a lot of information about revenue, placement, or all these different issues from other sorts from the ABA, and I thought, these are the issues my dean is dealing with, and so I need to always keep that in mind too.
Yeah. Well, I served for 5 years as associate dean for management and budget with America, and I learned that same perspective very quickly in that role, and never really quite looked at the library director role the same exact way as I had before. It was a much more broadened perspective of where we fit. So I can understand where you're coming from. It sounds like you've had some wonderful experiences.
And also, and this is why I'm going to encourage people to get involved in ALL or ALS. My mother always said, never pass up an opportunity to work with smart people. Yeah. And you sit at a table and you watch how other people handle themselves, how they take apart a problem, how they respond, how under pressure, how they figure how to find a solution to something. It's been a really good learning opportunity.
Well, I've noticed you've also been accorded some recognition for some of the things you've done of a more formal nature.
Oh.
For example, in 2002, you received what's now known as the Roy and Mirsky
Yeah.
Spirit of Law Librarianship
Yeah.
Award. And then more recently, the University of Minnesota President's Award for outstanding service. You must have a role in the campus wide in
Yeah.
some ways to
Yeah.
achieve that.
Well, these honors are very humbling in many ways, and I can always think of many people who deserve them more than I do, but it's been a great honor. But I do think that it's important to, if you do have time to be involved in the greater university, I think especially as the library director, if you kind of get to know some of the people in other parts of campus, sometimes they're colleagues you can call upon when various issues come up. And I think especially, I mean, one of the, at Berkeley, I think one of the things Bob told me is get to know the people in personnel, and that really has made life a lot easier, you know, at the campus level. So, and you know, once again, I think you have to figure out what your priorities are and not spread yourself too thin. But if you can kind of say, well, what campus opportunities would be most worthwhile, and then at the other level, what speaks to what's important to you, and then try to work those into your life. I think it looks good on your resume that you have done things that are beyond the law school. I think this happens to a lot of librarians or library directors, especially if they have tenure. You know, I've been on this Faculty Senate Judicial Committee, which is the kind of the committee that if there's a tenure denial or something, and there's someone's filing a petition for review or something, but they always like to have a couple lawyers in the room for that, and you meet great people from all over the campus. But I think right now I'm doing something which I personally find very rewarding, is that I'm on the campus-wide ROTC committee. And it has nothing to do with the law school, because our students are in ROTC, but you know, you're working, it's just something that's a little bit out of your normal universe, and yes, it's so worthwhile. And it also is kind of a humbling experience to yet work with those young men and women who are working so hard and, you know, prepared to go into the military. But it's different, and it's fun, and it keeps you energized, I think.
It keeps the job interesting.
Yeah.
It's diverse in that sense. I relish those opportunities over the years. I was in a much smaller shop, so probably a little harder to get involved here at the university, where it's so large. But still, you've done it.
Yeah, well, and I think sometimes it's important, and to, you know, when you're an organization for a long time, you're often the person who's always called to chair a committee or chair to serve on a program or something like that. And sometimes it's good to step back and say, you know, maybe it's time for other people to have that opportunity, and why don't I do something else for a while? But and also these new people, they might freshen up the program a little bit, or, you know, and I certainly ALL is very good about this, you know, training the leadership for the future. So sometimes, even if you're still enjoying what you're doing in an association or in a job, it's kind of, well, you know, maybe I should let somebody else have a chance at this.
I know that ALL, in terms of program planning, targets people that have not done it before.
Yeah, and I think that's
to
great.
give both them opportunities and
great.
also introduce perhaps new ideas.
I think it's very good.
Fresh approaches to
Yeah,
things.
that's how we all learn. Well, and that's kind of what you should do in your library. You know, I think sometimes having maybe somebody newer on your staff chair a committee, or have them on the search committees and things like that. I think that makes a big
their
difference.
role more interesting and probably more important to the outcome of the university library.
You know, this just crossed my mind, and I keep reflecting back on Mr. Jacobson, but he really was so important in my life. And I always remember, and I've used this. I've used this at times, and people look a little horrified that this would have happened. But we moved into the new building in Stanford in 1975. So I wasn't even through library school yet, and we were having our ABA ALS sabbatical accreditation. Now, I had no idea what this was. I just knew I had to clean up my desk. I didn't know what any of this. I was just kind of bumbling. And so Mr. Jacobstein came, and we were just moving into this new building, and he said, Joan, Francis Gates is going to be coming, and he's going to be talking to me about the library, but somebody needs to give him a tour. Would you give him a tour? Well, not only did I know nothing about accreditation, I had no idea who Francis Gates was. You know, he was, I learned shortly thereafter that he was the director at Columbia, and quite an imposing individual.
Yeah.
But it was a wonderful thing to do because, you know, it took me about a day to put together. This was, the pressure was, I mean, and so, you know, I rehearsed my little tour and did things like, and I gave him a tour, and of course he asked me some very specific questions, and certainly was not quite as nurturing all the time as Mr. Jacobstein was during this tour, but it was a wonderful experience to give your most junior librarian. And you know, because usually, you know, the director would give the tour,
Yes.
or the head of public services, or something like that. And it was, but that's how I think and so, you know, you do it once, okay, I could do this again, you know, but it was, and I think sometimes a director, though, I've often reflected on that, although I never felt anything, I'm sure that maybe some people on the library staff maybe didn't understand why he was doing that. You know, that, well, shouldn't he give the tour, or shouldn't somebody else? But I think it's that kind of trying to find people that might have some potential. And believe me, if I had potential, anybody has potential. But you know, just trying to nurture people and give them confidence, and throwing them maybe in the deep end once in a while. You know.
Well, I did a similar thing in another way when we were being inspected one time. You know, the library inspector wanted to meet the librarians and assumed I was a librarian, I'd be in there. And I suggested, why don't you meet with all the other librarians, and I will be elsewhere. And then they can be candid with you, and you can ask them and discuss anything you want.
That's a good idea.
And later it came back to me how surprised everybody was, even my own staff, that I basically let that happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't worry about what they were going to do. I figured they wouldn't do me in, hopefully. And they didn't. But even the inspector said that this was something he'd never had happen before. You know, he'd done a number of these inspections.
Yeah, good.
But it gave them a chance to be fully candid if they wanted to.
Well, and it shows your confidence in them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I worked with them and I thought I could trust them. And if I couldn't, I deserved what that inspector would hear, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, Joan, we've talked a lot about you and the profession and things. Is there anything before we close the conversation that you want to bring up?
Well, you know, the only thing is that, I mean, first of all, and I'm sure that you've heard this from other people you've been talking to, that I think that anyone who either chooses the law library profession or somehow stumbles into it or sometimes is pushed, I think will find it an incredible profession. I think those of us who have had the opportunity to have careers in law librarianship have been truly blessed. I mean, it's just been a wonderful, wonderful profession. I think it's like anything in life, you make your own luck. And you just kind of have to figure out where you're going. And I think, you know, don't look at just this job, but where you want that job to take you and that sort of thing. I think that there's a lot of discussion about how law librarianship is changing. Legal education is changing. The world's changing, and so we need to change with that. And I think that if the librarian, or any position in the library, is flexible, is astute, who really tries to keep the big picture on the horizon and all the time, I think as they move forward, they're going to find this profession as satisfying, if not even more satisfying. I think there's a lot of discussion about how technology is really changing everything. Well, you know, technology is always, we've always had changes in technology, whether it was going from doing cataloging cards by pencil to using a typewriter, or you know, I remember when Lexis and Westlaw first came in, and how is this going to change everything? Or dialogue, I remember dialogue, and you just adapt, you change, you figure out how you can use these new technologies to really serve your students and your faculty and others that you serve. And so I think that it's just a wonderful opportunity, and it's, I would I think that the new generation that I see, that are people who are younger, the future directors or future, have any position in the library, I find them incredibly bright and talented, and I think I'm excited about the future of librarianship, even though I know that I'm probably going to be looking at it from afar in a few years, you know, but it's a wonderful profession, and I guess.
Well, even watching the changes in
Yes.
just the last decade since I retired, and,
Yes.
I sort of look at it and say, well, I'm sort of glad I retired. But, you know,
Yeah.
it's got to be exciting.
Yeah,
And,
it's-
empowering
Yeah.
in whole new ways.
And I guess, and I think this is something probably has always been true, but maybe now more than ever, is that I think there really needs to be more opportunity to develop collegial academic opportunities from the more senior librarians and the junior librarians, because they can learn so much from each other.
Mhm.
You know, and I think that that's something we all have to keep in mind. You know, sometimes someone who's younger says, well, what, you know, things are changing so quickly. Can I really, what does someone maybe who's a little older, what, oh, sure, they can offer me as a role model, but, you know, and there's an awful lot, because there's very few problems, even with technology, that people senior haven't dealt with in some ways, a management issue, or as a personnel issue or something, but, or just solving a problem, but then also I think people my age, we really have to be looking at the younger ones, younger librarians or newer librarians, and saying, what can I learn from you? They're much more connected with what the law students need today, or what the law students want, or what's fresh, what's exciting, I just think there needs to be more opportunities for the two groups to interact.
The young ones have learned during the digital era. You and I learned during the transition as
yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And that's different. I
Yeah.
remember recently, one of my sisters explained she was visiting her daughter, who was in the hospital briefly, and she brought a disc to play on the TV in the hospital, and it put it in the machine, and it wouldn't play. And her 5-year-old grandson announced that, well, Grandma, that's a Blu-ray disc. And this is a DVD player.
Yeah.
I don't think my sister knew what the
Difference
difference was,
was.
but she learned that
Quickly.
one of them wouldn't play on the other, whatever it was.
That's true.
She could go to her young grandson to find out which was which, I
Yeah,
guess,
so-
when she needed it.
Yeah, so and I mean, that's what, and we have to say, we can learn from everyone, whether it be a 5-year-old or a 25-year-old or
Exactly.
40-year-old, and somebody who's 90 years old.
Certainly, I think on that, Joan Howland, I'd like to thank you on my behalf, but also on behalf of our colleagues Michelle Wu, Frank Hodak, and of course Dick Spinelli, with whom I have the privilege of working to put together this oral history of law librarianship for the Spinelli's Law Library Reference Shelf portion of Fine Online.
Well, it's been an honor and a pleasure to participate, so thank you very, very much. I feel very honored to have had this opportunity. Thank you.